Thanks very much for coming today. My name's Clayton Lewis. I'm the curator of graphics over at the Clements Library, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. But at first, we've got a few items of business. I'd like to bring to your attention that at the library we have some upcoming events in our Discover series, and the dates will be Thursday, February 14th at 11 a.m. in the morning, Love Letters and Romance in the Archives, presented by Assistant Curator Jane Ptolemy. Also on Thursday, February 28th in the afternoon at 4 o'clock will be Beyond the Lens, Hidden Features of 19th Century Ambrotypes, featuring Clements Library Conservator Julie Freemuth with Assistant Graphics Curator Louie Miller. On Thursday, March 21 at 11 a.m., Merging the Old and the New, Bird's Eye Views of America with University of Michigan graduate student Corey Schmidt and Clements Library Director Kevin Graffinino. And on Thursday, March 28th at 4 in the afternoon, a close look at Views d'Optique with Clements Library's graphics cataloger Jacob Dopp and myself. And these events will all take place at the Clements Library in the ground level meeting room. We would encourage you to register for these in advance online at our website, or if you would have any questions, please talk to our development team at the table in the back of the room. Also, for your information, those of you that are members of the Clements Library Associates and are awaiting the next issue of the Quarto, it will be out very shortly and hitting the mail in the next few weeks and features an issue on the experience of American soldiers. And also, at this point, it would be a good reminder to silence our phones. I will do mine right now. This event will be taped, and the video will appear later on the Clements Library website. There will be questions and answers after today's talk. We do have runners with microphones, so if you have a question after the talk, raise your hand and we will get you a microphone so everyone in the group can hear the question. So today's talk, Over There, with the American Expeditionary Forces in France during the Great War, will be presented by Louie Miller, Assistant Curator and Reading Room Supervisor of the William L. Clements Library. Louie has a Master's of Science and Information from the University of Michigan's School of Information, where he specialized in archives and records management. He received his Bachelors in History from Kalamazoo College. Louie took an interest in World War I as an undergrad student at K College, and he developed his ideas about the American involvement in the conflict into his senior thesis. As a research assistant for the University of Michigan's Bicentennial Office, he tracked soldiers from the Great War that had University of Michigan connections. Louie Miller is also the curator of the current exhibit Over There, which is over there at the Clements Library at the moment until April 26. And he has an article titled Honor for All, Commemoration of the First World War in Kalamazoo, which will be appearing in Michigan Historical Review later this year. So needless to say, this is a topic he's given a lot of thought to, and he's very well informed as a presenter. Part of the mission of the Clements, beyond providing access to information, is to inspire scholars to be passionate about their work. And it helps if we have a staff that is also passionate about what they do. One of the reasons Louie got the job that he currently holds is that he impressed us with his passion for history and his ability to share that. As a measure of this, we found out recently that Louie was thrilled when he received a brass World War I shell casing turned into a work of trench art as a Hanukkah gift from his parents. This is true. I think it's safe to say that this is not normal behavior for somebody of his generation, but for the Clements Library, it is exactly what we look for in an employee. So if you would please join me in welcoming Louie Miller.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming here today on this balmy Tuesday afternoon. And thank you, Clayton, for the kind introduction. I'm honored to be here today to speak with you all about the exhibit I curated that is currently on display at the Clements, entitled, as Clayton said, Over There with the American Expeditionary Forces in France During the Great War. This exhibit focuses on the experiences of the approximately 2 million Americans who served in France. From here on in this talk, when I refer to the American Expeditionary Forces, I will use the acronym AEF. I plan to share with you some interesting aspects of the First World War that I came across through my research on the various items that I chose to display in my exhibit, which I hope you will have the chance to view after the lecture. If for whatever reason you are not able to make it to the special exhibit viewing, have no fear. The exhibit will be open to the public on Fridays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. through April 26th. All the visuals you are about to see are images of exhibit pieces, mostly originals, though with some reproductions of materials held by other institutions. While large-scale combat began in August 1914, the United States did not enter into the Great War until over 2.5 years later. However, this does not mean that before this there was a complete lack of American interest in the catastrophic events underway in Europe. Long before we officially joined the war on April 6, 1917, private citizens, many very wealthy, formed groups to support the Allied war effort. One such group, the American Fund for French Wounded, founded in 1915 by wealthy American women living abroad, provided medical care and other material support for wounded Allied soldiers in France, which they talked about in monthly newsletters, such as the one that you can see up on the screen. The treasurer of the organization was Anne Morgan of the J.P. Morgan & Co. fortune. That Anne Morgan was so involved in this organization is unsurprising, as some of you might already be aware, given how invested, quite literally, the Morgan family was in the Allied cause, to the point that Anne's brother, J.P. Morgan Jr., was the object of an assassination attempt by a German spy in 1915. The Motor Corps service of the American Fund for French Wounded, which required members to supply their own vehicles in order to join, gained the nickname of the Heiress Corps and counted Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas among its many members. However, this does not mean that all Americans, or even the majority of Americans, supported the side of the Allies. Keep in mind that German Americans were one of the largest ethnic groups in America at the outbreak of the war. Many Americans of German descent resisted attempts by groups such as the American Fund for French Wounded to paint the Germans as the aggressors in the conflict. Publications such as The Fatherland fought back against this portrayal of the war and encouraged readers to send material support to German soldiers. At its height, The Fatherland reached a weekly circulation of over 75,000 copies in the United States. And German Americans were not the only immigrant ethnic group that resisted supporting the Allies. Both Irish Americans, because of Britain, and Jewish Americans, because of Russia, did not initially back the Allied cause, even after American entry into the war, because of long-held animosity towards both of those countries. Many African-American newspapers and intellectuals pointed out the hypocrisies of Wilsonian democracy while they were being denied their democratic rights at home. Whereas other leading African-Americans, such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Emmett J. Scott, advocated for a temporary setting aside of grievances while the war raged. This was a matter of much discussion among black communities across the country. As A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen, editors of the socialist newspaper The Messenger, put it in November 1917, quote, "Let Du Bois, Kelly, Miller, Pickens, Grimke, etc. volunteer to go to France to make the world safe for democracy. We would rather make Georgia safe for the Negro." While many would argue, and I can see why, that the entry of the United States into the war was inevitable, certain events definitely helped push this country into the global conflict. One well-known incident was the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which we will discuss in more detail shortly. Other events included the Black Tom explosion by German saboteurs in 1916 at New York Harbor, which targeted American munitions that were ready to ship to Russia, with an explosion massive enough to cause significant damage to the Statue of Liberty and be heard by residents as far away as Maryland. Or the Zimmerman telegram in 1917, a coded message intercepted by British intelligence that revealed Germany desired a military alliance with Mexico including the proposal that Mexico reconquer Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if the United States entered the war. All of these served to push public opinion toward anti-German sentiment. These incidents seemed to prove to Americans at the time that the country was already under threat from Germany. The attack on the Lusitania on May 7, 1915, caused the deaths of 1,198 passengers and crew, including 128 Americans. Although Germany protested it have every right to treat the Lusitania as an enemy vessel, the incident led to outrage in the United States and Britain. In response to American indignation, the Germans stopped their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare in September of 1915. One of the most interesting events related to the sinking of the Lusitania is the creation of hundreds of thousands of British copies of a medal made by the German artist Karl Goetz after the incident. You have a chance to see one of these British copies in the exhibit if you go over after the lecture. Goetz had intended his medal as a satire of British and American anger over the Lusitania, mocking the supposed impartiality of the United States, which claimed neutrality while at the same time supplying Germany's enemies with major military supplies. The British got their hands on a copy of the medal and then disseminated over 300,000 replicas with an accompanying English translation in mid-1916. Goetz had originally put the date of the event as May 5th before realizing his error and correcting it to May 7th on later versions of the medal. The British seized upon this earlier date of May 5th as evidence that the Germans had pre-planned the sinking of the ship long before it had left New York Harbor. The British also wrongly claimed that the medal was an official German government commemoration and celebration of the event. These claims helped to further the narrative of German barbarity at a time when the ruthless suppression of the Easter Uprising in Ireland made Britain appear quite the hypocrite to many Americans. The damage done by this piece of British propaganda led to German authorities confiscating all known copies of the original medal by January 1917. And the German policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which ended, as I said earlier, in September 1915, largely due to American indignation over the Lusitania, started back up again in early 1917 and became a major casus belli for America's entry into the war. When the United States declared war on Germany, it was in no position to send an army to Europe. The American army at the time was an undersized, tactically obsolete fighting force. Here are some figures to illustrate this. In April 1917, the United States had some 200,000 soldiers ready for service. Now consider that the British Army suffered over 19,000 killed on July 1st, 1916, first day of the Battle of the Somme, or that the French suffered 27,000 dead during the Battle of the Frontiers on August 22nd, 1914. Over 46,000, basically a fourth of the size of the pre-war American army, dead in just 2 days of fighting. It is not surprising then that American officials did not expect American infantry to contribute significantly to the war effort until 1919, though of course, and luckily for the Allies, this ended up not being the case. By the end of the conflict, on November 11th, 1918, the number of Americans in various branches of the Army numbered over 4 million, an increase of 20 times its size in little over a year and a half. The vast majority of the 2 million American soldiers in Europe, which included some 10,000 Marines in the AEF's 2nd Division, served on the Western Front in France and Belgium. But Americans also served in Italy and Siberia, where the latter became known as the Polar Bear Expedition, which many of you may know about because of how many soldiers from Michigan served there. These images up in front of you depict soldiers training at Fort Custer, Michigan in 1917. Notice that some of the men have real rifles, but the majority of them are holding wooden sticks. The artillery piece depicted is also made of wood. Unfortunately, lack of adequate training supplies was an all too common experience for American soldiers in the First World War. Harold Camp, a private in the 146th Field Artillery, described drilling with wooden bayonets because there was, quote, no steel bayonets to be issued. The majority of the American Army's weapons in 1917 were either woefully outdated or unavailable in quantities large enough to equip a fighting force capable of holding its own in Europe. While American war production picked up by the middle of 1918, the majority of the AEF relied on mostly French and also some British weapons in combat, from planes to artillery pieces. Most American soldiers sent to France left New York Harbor on a transport ship, guarded by a naval escort, before arriving in either Liverpool, England, or Brest, France. The trip over took approximately 2 weeks. While there were some comforts on board, such as music and other forms of entertainment, seasickness was a constant source of irritation, and the fear of a German U-boat attack was ever present. However, with the exception of a few incidents, such as the sinking of the Tuscania on February 5, 1918, the U-boats were unable to stop the steady stream of American troops arriving overseas. The majority of the troops who served in France arrived between May and September of 1918. The single busiest month, July, saw well over 300,000 Americans arrive in Europe. More than half the members of the AEF crossed the Atlantic in foreign vessels, primarily British ships. Again, another example of our country's lack of preparedness and reliance on our allies for material support. On the screen right now is a Signal Corps photograph of one of these British transport ships, Coronia, in Brest Harbor, France in January 1919. As an aside, you will hear me refer to the Signal Corps, the branch of the United States Army in charge of communication, often in this talk, because the American Signal Corps in World War I, among its many other tasks, was in charge of photographing the activities of the AEF. In this Signal Corps image, the Coronia displays the vertigo-inducing razzle-dazzle camouflage used by the Allied ships during the latter half of the war. The theory for using such camouflage was that it would make it much harder for a German U-boat to estimate a target's range, speed, and heading. Despite its reputation at the time, however, gauging the actual effectiveness of razzle-dazzle is difficult to determine. American troops arriving in France frequently commented on seeing labor, usually reserved for young men, done by women, children, and the elderly, as depicted in this photograph. I saw this mentioned in countless letters that I read in the Clements Library collections while researching for this project. Of the over 8 million French soldiers in the war, 1.4 million were killed, and a further 4.3 million wounded. There simply weren't enough men of fighting age around to help with these sort of tasks. Dr. Clarence E. Burt, surgeon with the 183rd Infantry Brigade, observed, quote, "One seldom sees an able-bodied man anywhere between the ages of 20 and 60. While the Americans were surprised by the amount of unladylike behavior French women, due to the dire situation at hand, performed, we need to remember that it was not only American men who served in France. Over 16,500 women traveled overseas as part of the AEF. They served as members of the Army, civilian contractors, or as members of official welfare agencies. One such woman was Grace D. Banker, Passaic, New Jersey, whose portrait is up in front of you now. Banker graduated from Barnard College in 1915 and began work as a telephone switchboard operator. The Signal Corps issued a command in November of 1917 for women volunteers who were fluent in French to serve as telephone operators overseas. These volunteers eventually gained the nickname Hello Girls. Banker was the leader of the first unit of Hello Girls sent to Europe. In all, some 223 women served in this capacity in France. Banker served 20 months overseas and received the Distinguished Service Medal for her meritorious service during the Sammy-Hell and Meuse-Argonne offensives. She died in Scarsdale, New York on December 17, 1960. The United States government did not recognize the Hello Girls as veterans until 1979, when only 18 of the 223 women were still alive. And in fact, before any American troops embarked overseas, American nurses were already serving the Allied cause. In May 1917, the War Department requested the Red Cross to send nurses to France to serve with the British Expeditionary Force. Nurses in the service of the AEF came from actually two different organizations, the Red Cross and the Army Nurse Corps. Oftentimes, the line between them was blurred. So blurred, in fact, that Julia Stimson, who after the war was the first woman to achieve the rank of major in the United States Army, served for a time as both chief nurse of the American Red Cross and director of the nursing services of the AEF. Nurses for both of these groups served in the same capacity, even at the same hospitals. Two major differences that did exist for these nurses was that Red Cross nurses were not eligible for disability benefits from the Army, while Army nurses were committed indefinitely to service rather than the 2-year enlistment period for the Red Cross. These two photographs document the daily work of the men and women of Base Hospital 29. While the vast majority of the 135 base hospitals of the AEF were located in France, a few such as this one were located in England. Base Hospital 29 was in operation from August 1st, 1918 to January 12th, 1919. During this time, the hospital cared for approximately 4,000 cases, of which the majority were surgical. Base hospitals were just one part of the complex medical system developed for the care of wounded and sick soldiers. Mobile medical units known as field hospitals operated closely behind the front lines, with cases requiring emergency surgery sent to evacuation hospitals from the field hospital. Base hospitals were where soldiers requiring the most serious long-term care would be sent after treatment at an evacuation hospital. Field hospitals, in particular, because of their proximity to the fighting, could be very dangerous places to work. I read of multiple incidents where soldiers waiting to get patched up for some sort of slight wound to the arm or leg ended up being killed by a stray German shell, scoring a direct hit on their medical tent. While the influenza epidemic of 1918 is the most well-known and deadly medical phenomenon of the American experience in the First World War, it was actually venereal disease that was the most cited cause of medical disability in the AEF. American soldiers did not receive prophylaxis such as condoms because General John J. Pershing, commander of the AEF, feared that the news would not be well received by progressives back in the United States. Instead, the AEF practiced chemical prophylaxis. This process involved irrigating the urethra and bladder with potassium permanganate or some other antiseptic solution and applying a topical antiseptic to the genitals. Soldiers were required to undergo this medical treatment immediately after intercourse, and if they failed to do so and were later diagnosed with venereal disease, they could be court-martialed. Organizations cooperating with the AEF, such as the YMCA, also provided sex education to soldiers while in France. One such attempt is this item on the screen, a small pamphlet handed out by the YWCA to soldiers to encourage their abstinence while abroad. These different approaches to combating the spread of venereal disease seem to have worked decently well. At the very least, the American Army suffered venereal disease cases at a much lower rate than did their allies. One of the most important parts of understanding the American experience in the First World War is to look at the experience of black soldiers. The treatment of African Americans within the AEF was, for the most part, truly shocking. And for those of you interested in learning more, Chad L. Williams' 2010 publication, Torchbearers of Democracy, is a great source. An incident that had major repercussions for African American troops occurred not in France, but right here in our own country. Before any American troops saw action on the front lines, white police officers in Houston, Texas, during August of 1917, brutally beat 2 black soldiers from the regular army who were on leave from nearby Camp Logan. This led to what is now known as the Houston Riot. In all, 4 soldiers and 16 civilians were killed during the uprising, with 19 more soldiers executed after a military trial. Segregationists used this incident as evidence that black soldiers could not be trusted with weapons. And while more than half of white American troops in France were classified as combat troops, only 19% of the approximately 180,000 African Americans who served in France were classified as such. The vast majority of African American members of the AEF, like their forebears in previous conflicts, such as the Civil War, were forced to do hard labor instead of fighting. This included loading supplies, but also the miserable task of dealing with the dead left behind on the battlefield. This photograph shows soldiers of Company A, 321st Labor Battalion, preparing a burial trench on December 1st, 1918. Notice how some of the men are still wearing uniform pieces from the Spanish-American War. This is the front and back of an aerial pamphlet dropped over soldiers of the 92nd Division during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The 92nd Division, along with the 93rd, were the two African-American combat divisions in France. The First World War was the first conflict to use aerial propaganda on a large scale in an attempt to weaken soldiers' morale. The actual argument made in this pamphlet is not hard to agree with. For while black soldiers were in France risking life and limb for their country refused to clamp down on the domestic terrorism practiced against its African-American citizens at home. The 92nd Division was unfairly singled out for poor performance during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Its lack of success in its first ever combat operation, which by no means was uncommon for American divisions at all, was used by many high-ranking officers, including AEF Commander John J. Pershing, after the war as a prime example of the inferiority of African-American troops, and in particular, African-American officers. This is African-American artist Horace Pippin's The End of the War, Starting Home, painted circa 1930. The original is held in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Pippin, a member of the famous Harlem Hellfighters, 369th Infantry, 93rd Division, took up painting after the war to strengthen his right arm, which had been shot by a German sniper. Painting also helped Pippin process the trauma of his wartime experience. He had seen heavy combat and had even spent an entire day lying wounded in a shell with a dead French soldier on top of him before being rescued. This painting in particular does a fantastic job of capturing the confusion and scale of the combat experience on the Western Front. For those of you interested, Pippin's handwritten account of his service in France has been digitized and is available on the Smithsonian's website. If someone wanting to learn the nitty-gritty details of the combat experiences of AEF soldiers like Horace Pippin were to read stacks of wartime correspondence, they would find very little of value. Why? Well, the easy answer is because of censorship. All mail sent by members of the AEF was read over by a censor, with offending passages clipped or blotted out of the letter, as you can see in this example on the screen. Officers censored their men's mail and had to censor their own as well. Most members of the AEF also practiced self-censorship, as they had been taught to do as part of their training. Among other restrictions, soldiers were not to mention the towns or localities they occupied, discuss troop movements, use any sort of cipher, or have letters published in newspapers. Officers were not supposed to discuss the letters they censored, but inevitably it happened. One such lieutenant quipped in a letter to his mother, quote, "Of course I'm not supposed to tell what I read, but I had to laugh at one guy who wrote to his wife telling her how he loved her, etc., and then he wrote to 3 or 4 other dames at the same time, giving them a line of gush." Though censorship is one of the most well-known aspects of the First World War, perhaps what the war is most remembered for today is the use of new methods of warfare, such as tanks, chemical weapons, aircraft, and machine guns. We will now discuss some aspects of these new methods and advances in military technology. When the first American troops arrived in France in 1917, they were supplied with British Mark I helmets. It was not until January 1918 that the AEF began to use American-made helmets, which were known as the M1917. Except for a few minor differences, the helmet was almost identical to the British Mark I. A helmet was finished with sawdust or sand in order to make it non-reflective. And from the design, you can see why German soldiers called this helmet Salatschüssel, which translates to salad bowl. Remarkably, it was only after almost 2 years of war that the combatants on the Western Front used steel helmets on all of their infantrymen. Notice that this helmet's owner painted it with the 91st Division's insignia of a pine tree. This was almost certainly done after the war as a form of trench art. Actually, many American soldiers painted their division insignia on their helmets after the war. If you were to go on eBay right now and type in World War I helmet, you would find tons of examples. In the beginning of the war, aircraft was used almost exclusively for reconnaissance work, but by the time the Americans entered the fray, airplanes could be outfitted with machine guns and used as bombers. However, even with these improvements in combat capability, the value of aircraft during the war was mostly in direct coordination with infantry and artillery, such as reporting troop movements or providing accurate firing ranges for artillery. This image is the wreckage of a French plane shot down behind German lines. A member of the AEF Signal Corps took this photograph on July 27, 1918, not long after American troops captured the area during the Second Battle of the Marne. This image is a stereograph of the grave of Lieutenant Quentin Roosevelt in France. Quentin Roosevelt, the youngest son of President Theodore Roosevelt's children, served in France as a lieutenant of the 95th American Aero Squadron. On July 14, 1918, during aerial combat over Chamaris, 2 bullets to the head killed Roosevelt, and his plane crashed behind German lines. The Germans in the vicinity found his identification papers on his body, and recognizing him as the son of a former American president, gave him a ceremonial burial and erected a wooden cross on his grave. When Americans took the area only a few days later, they discovered the grave, and with French help, built a more substantial monument in Roosevelt's honor. The death of Quentin Roosevelt was international news at the time, and thousands of Allied soldiers visited his grave to pay their respects. In 1955, Quentin's body was reinterred at Normandy American Cemetery to lie next to the grave of his eldest brother, Ted, who died from a heart attack while serving in France in 1944. The First World War was the first conflict to use heavily armored fighting vehicles known as tanks in combat. While the British and French first used tanks in 1916 and 17, respectively, the Germans did not construct any until 1918. And while the Allies built over 6,000 tanks by the end of the war, the Germans remarkably only ever built 20. The AEF Tank Corps, common theme, relied on Allied machines because American-built tanks did not arrive in France before the armistice. This photograph is of a German A-7V tank, Mephisto, that was abandoned by its crew in April 1918. Graffiti on the sides of the tank reveal that Australian soldiers claimed this as a war prize, dragging it back to their lines while under fire in July 1918. Mephisto is the only surviving example of a German A-7V and is currently on display at the Queensland Museum in Brisbane, Australia. On October 26, 1918, Douglas MacArthur, as commander of the 84th Brigade, 42nd Division, received this list identifying different types of German 77mm shells and the poisonous chemicals they carried. The Clements Library holds numerous intelligence reports such as this one received by MacArthur during his time in command of the 84th Brigade. The use of chemical warfare during the First World War is one of the most enduring and well-known aspects of that conflict, though in terms of sheer numbers, it is much less deadly than was artillery fire and machine gun fire. As early as 1914, the French were using tear gas against German forces, but the Germans were the first to use gas as a killing agent at Ypres, Belgium, in April 1915. While the French and British expressed outrage, they quickly retaliated and began making and using their own deadly gas shells in combat. The most commonly used chemical weapon during the war was a sulfur-based agent known as mustard gas because of its distinct odor. But of the 91,000 deaths attributed to chemical warfare, the vast majority were the results of phosgene and diphosgene gas. Actually, for those of you that want a first-hand account of the horrors of gas, read the famous British war poets Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est and The Sentry. For those of you planning to attend the lecture or the exhibit viewing after this, make sure you read, in one of the cases, I have the full text of Owen's The Sentry poem. It's well worth looking at. These are troops of the 366th Infantry undergoing gas mask inspection on August 8, 1918, at Unvel, France. These troops are wearing the American-made Corrected English Model, or CEM, masks. While by August 1918, troops were receiving much better gas instruction, the first 6 American divisions to arrive in France had received no training on chemical warfare before embarking overseas. This lack of preparation led many inexperienced American units to suffer from what was called the gas jitters, meaning that when a gas alarm went off, soldiers were thrown into absolute panic, often suffering avoidable casualties. For example, when members of the 1st Division first encountered gas shortly after entering the front lines in January of 1918, one soldier, quote, rushed down the trench screaming and made no attempt to put on his respirator. He died shortly after reaching the dressing station. Another, quote, couldn't find his respirator and became panic-stricken. When it was found and finally adjusted, he claimed it was broken and changed into his French mask, breathing in gas while he changed. On the way to the dressing station, he repeatedly pulled the French mask away from his face and breathed the gas-laden air, and died shortly after reaching the station. This was very common with units first encountering gas. And to make matters worse, a common practical joke among soldiers was actually to yell gas when there was no actual alarm. This French pamphlet, translated into English in 1918, was disseminated to both American and British units, instructing them on how to operate a German machine gun. The copy on display in the exhibit was actually Douglas MacArthur's personal copy. When war broke out in 1914, all the combatants had machine guns as part of their arsenal, and the use of machine guns continued throughout the war. But even though it was an American, Hiram Maxim, who was the first person to invent an automatic firearm in 1883, the leadership of the AEF treated machine guns as having secondary importance to the rifle. This would prove costly to American soldiers when they entered combat. Also, the American tactics for attacking German machine guns involved head-on charges that led to, in the eyes of their Allied counterparts, unnecessarily high casualty rates. I mean, the British and French were truly horrified at sometimes how the Americans would sacrifice their men in the face of machine gun fire. It's not surprising, then, that American troops rarely took prisoners once they had captured a German machine gun nest. Allied propaganda made the average German soldier seem like a bloodthirsty maniac, hell-bent on destroying democracy and willing to use any number of dirty tricks to destroy his enemy. One very common claim made by American soldiers was that they found dead Germans chained to their machine guns. Horace Pippin and many others repeated this fact just as a matter of fact in their memoirs. The German rationale, so the Americans thought, was to make it impossible for that soldier to retreat, with their only option being to kill as many attackers as possible. This story was repeated thousands of times, with soldiers swearing they had seen this with their own eyes. However, historians have found no evidence to support this claim. It seems that this myth arose out of Allied soldiers coming across dead German machine gunners and misinterpreting what they had seen. German machine guns had a leather-covered chain belt attached to the gun so that the soldier in charge could put the belt across his torso and move the very heavy gun without wrecking his arm strength. If a German machine gunner was killed while wearing this belt, it could look as if he was chained to his weapon. The dead German in this photograph was probably killed while stationary. At least there's no belt on the body. But what of the fate of the approximately 116,000 Americans that died in this conflict? It's a staggering number, especially considering that the vast majority of AEF troops only saw action in the last 6 months of the war. And even within that, probably the last 3 months of the war, really. Families back in the United States, for the most part, did not receive word of their loved one's death until months after it occurred. And I want you all to think now, because if the majority of the American troops really fought between September and November of 1918, many of these families heard the news of the armistice before they actually received word that their son had been killed while fighting. This telegraph up on screen, sent to Mary Wildenhain of Grafton, Ohio on July 28, 1919, informed her that her son, Private William J. Wildenhain, had been killed in action. Though the telegraph did not contain the specific information on when he was killed, we now know that he died on October 14th, 1918, as part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Although sent to France as part of the 83rd Division, a division made up of drafted men, Wildenhain was transferred to Company C of the 7th Infantry on July 26th of 1918 to help replace the losses that regiment had suffered during the Second Battle of the Marne, the first major engagement for most of the AEF. Wildenhain is buried in the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery in France. His mother, Mary, who was a German immigrant, suffered immensely from the ravages of war, not just her son dying. Another son, Steve, was visiting family in Germany when war broke out in 1914 and was impressed into service in the German army. The fate of Steve Wildenhain is not known. This photograph, taken on December 2nd, 1918, depicts the remains of a deceased American soldier killed near Bazoches, France. The notes that accompany this Signal Corps photograph tell us that the body was unidentifiable due to the corrosion of the soldier's dog tags from both gas and bodily fluids. The body had been lying unburied for 3 months and no identification papers were found. The intensity of the fighting and the need for American soldiers to keep advancing meant that many dead Americans were left unburied for weeks and months after they fell. The sheer number of unidentifiable dead from the conflict led Britain, France, America, as well as other nations to dedicate monuments to these unknown soldiers in the years after the war. In American military cemeteries, the grave of an unknown soldier is marked with a cross reading, "Here rests in honored glory, an American soldier known but to God." The families of deceased American soldiers were able to choose whether their loved ones would be buried in an American military cemetery in France or in a private family plot back in America. In the end, about 70% of American remains returned home, with the rest placed in 8 permanent American military cemeteries. The actual retrieval of the bodies was both an arduous and gruesome task, done, as I said earlier, almost entirely by African American soldiers. As this photograph depicts, men would spread out into skirmish lines at 50-meter intervals with stretchers ready to gather up human remains. On an average day, a labor battalion of 100 men, working together with a graves registration unit, could cover some 64 square kilometers searching for corpses. The fact that each family was allowed by the government to make the ultimate choice about the fate of their loved ones' remains is a uniquely American experience of the war. One can see why the majority of families chose to have their deceased loved one buried in their family plot rather than in a field thousands of miles away from home, no matter how beautiful or well kept that field may have been. But it's not like the 30% of families who chose to have their soldier buried in a national cemetery in France didn't also have the desire to be able to visit and mourn at their loved one's grave. And their push for the right to do this actually led to one of the most unique and fascinating events in American post-war commemoration. In 1929, after a decade of political debate, President Calvin Coolidge signed a bill allocating $5 million to subsidize pilgrimages to Europe for the mothers of deceased American soldiers buried overseas. In all, some 6,000 women chose to take the 2-week trip across to visit their sons' graves. These trips are known as the Gold Star Mothers Pilgrimages and took place between 1930 and 1933. In a sad echo of the discrimination African American soldiers faced more than a decade earlier, African American Gold Star mothers were segregated from their white counterparts during the pilgrimages. A significant number of mothers who went overseas were foreign-born and included many Germans. One of them is actually the woman up on screen right now, Rosa Heidler Lawrence. Her son, Private First Class Joseph Lawrence, was wounded in late July while fighting with the 42nd Division, before dying of his wounds at a base hospital on November 21st, 1918. In late May 1930, newspapers across the country published this moving image of Lawrence weeping at the grave of her son. For those of you desiring to learn more about the retrieval of bodies and the planning of memorials, I highly recommend reading the work of Lisa Boudreau. The Clements hosted Dr. Boudreau for a lecture last November. If you are interested in American First World War commemoration, Boudreau's book, Bodies of War, is, in my opinion, the best piece of scholarship on the subject. With the deaths of the mothers of soldiers, like Rosa Lawrence, and no living veterans, as well as our experiences in later 20th century conflicts, the First World War has become a forgotten event in this country's historical memory. I hope that with talks and exhibits like the one currently on display at the Clements, the public will become more aware of how important this conflict was for shaping the world in which we live today, and will foster a greater appreciation for the hardships suffered by the men and women who served. Thank you very much. So I think we're going to do some Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to go ahead. Oh, sorry. We'll get to you next.
You mentioned that there were a time when the British and the French troops were aghast by the fact that the Americans would march headlong into German machine gun fire. After a few engagements, was there a policy to amend that careless procedure, or
Great question. You know, yes, it does seem like American troops were learning as they went in the field. I don't know. It wasn't like by the end of the war they were imitating the French and British. I think there was still this kind of you know, sort of patriotic idea that we actually knew better than they did. But there definitely has been, you know, kind of scholarship done on looking at the AEF's tactics and how they evolved as they experienced combat. And they definitely did, you know, if you looked at how they did things at the Second Battle of the Marne in July compared to the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September 1918, there's definitely some difference. But even then, but till the end of the war, the American tactics horrified their Allied counterparts.
I was wondering if you could tell us more about the flu epidemic, when and where that was, and how it connected to the warfare.
Oh, great, thank you for asking that, because this is the part of my exhibit and this talk that really doesn't get mentioned. And that's for a variety of reasons, including materials that were available at the Clements for the exhibit, as well as other campus units that have actually done great research and you know, exhibits on the Spanish flu. But that being said, I believe that about 20 to 40% of the American army was stricken with influenza. It killed more American soldiers died of disease during this war than from combat. Though that's, like I said before, basically because most of these Americans didn't even fight until the last 6 weeks of the war. The flu, in terms of how it affected soldiers, is actually up for debate, because you have people who, scholars are not sure how to interpret this, I guess. The rates of infection among frontline troops was actually much less than troops on naval transports and back in the States at various training camps. Whether this is because of lack of reporting, which it very well could be, and not that it actually was a difference, is unclear. There is some theory that there was a milder version of a flu that went around the soldiers earlier in 1918, or in the summer of 1918, and may have helped their immunity. But yes, the influenza, if there's one thing I could go back and kind of, you know, conjure up a document that would go in the exhibit, it would be to cover, you know, the flu, because it is such an important part of the American experience.
Canada was at war when Britain was at war, well before the American Declaration in 1917. Do you see much evidence of what I know just anecdotally of American volunteers showing up in Canadian forces, especially what became the Royal Canadian Flying Corps, I think?
Great, I'm so glad you brought this up, because
okay. I want to hear what you know.
well, so actually, believe it or not, like, this exhibit has led to people, you know, donating materials to us. One of our most recent donations is the letters of a soldier who, from Detroit, 16 years old, ran away from home and enlisted in Windsor in the Canadian Army. He served in the Canadian Army the entire war, and so we got some of his correspondence, photographs, absolutely remarkable. Same as you, I don't have you know, concrete numbers on how many. The Clements definitely has at least 2 or 3 other examples of soldiers, you know, serving in one brother's in the AEF, one brother's in the CEF. But in terms of exact numbers, no. I also think actually graphics curator Clayton Lewis also has family, you know, some of his relatives served in the Canadian Army instead of in the American one. Mm-hmm.
I have a question. You sometimes hear about the devastation of the landscape in the no man's lands. Did, in any of the letters you read, were soldiers talking about that? Or
Great question. You know what? Yes, and it's because it's one of, like, the only things that they can. It's not breaking the censor's rules if they can talk about, you know, kind of seeing what Jerry or Fritz or the Bosch, as they refer to them, have done. And oftentimes American soldiers are horrified by what they come across as these German divisions are retreating. They're mining the entire city, they're stealing, or they're just destroying paintings off the walls. Make sure you grab a pamphlet from the exhibit, because one of the excerpts in it is from a diary held at the Clements, where a soldier very articulately just goes off on a rant about what the Germans have done. But definitely, and if you look at like the Signal Corps photographs, a lot of them are just of like bombed buildings, mined bridges, things like that. And it is one of the most common kind of motifs that's talked about in soldiers' letters that have seen the front lines.
Yeah, first I want to thank you, because we always focus on World War II, and
you're
it's
welcome.
nice to get this period highlighted, so thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Twofold question. Number one is, you always read about the Germans with the mustard gas and that. Did the Allies have a similar technology that we use? That's
Yes.
number one. And then number two is, and I may have this wrong, but wasn't there a line called the Red Line that the French used against the Germans? Is that World War II? Is that World War I?
There was a line of defenses. There is I think that's maybe World War II, but there was a line of defenses constructed after the Franco-Prussian War that was kind of a similar idea to stop. They knew the Germans were going to invade again, and in the area of Verdun, the famous battle that the French fought in 1916 with the Germans, some of these forts. This was the place where these forts were built. But yeah, I'm not sure. But as long as you've mentioned that, there is an interesting thing about this. It's called the Red Zone, and it's still in existence to this day in France. A part of the country that had so many gas shells and so many unexploded shells in it, they've didn't allow anybody to come back to their villages, and it's still uninhabited today. So if you look up, Red Zone or Zone Rouge in France, World War I, you'll find tons of articles and photos. It's fascinating.
Two clarifications. Gentleman referred to the Royal Canadian Flying Corps. There was no such ones. The Canadians all went to the Royal Flying Corps, which was done by the British Army and later became the Royal Air Force. About Americans learning hard lessons in combat, it was not as clear-cut because the American units had a number of advisors, both in the U.S. and in Europe, from the French and British armies, teaching them things that General Pershing did not want them taught, how to fight in trenches. I forget the line on that. So that was a common problem, as you said, throughout the war, but there was some learning about that. And you've been talking about the Meuse-Argonne combat. That, first of all, that was the largest American army ever deployed in battle, despite all the World War II. And secondly, that was fought in heavily wooded terrain. So you couldn't do these lines of soldiers. You had to do kind of Indian tactics.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Hi, Louie. I have a question. Did the American forces use horses to the extent that the British Army did?
I think all the sides relied heavily on, beasts of burden
Right.
for moving equipment and supplies.
But going into the battle, as depicted in the play War Horse, and for folks who saw the movie, I mean that's one incident. But would these horses have been brought from America? Or did they just use British?
Oh, great question. Now that I'm not sure about. I'll look into that for you and let you know.
Okay.
Great question.
I have a quick question. Do you mind?
Sure, go ahead.
The tank discrepancy. Did that matter at all? And I'm just curious about that because that's a huge.
Yeah, thanks for
difference.
bringing that up. I think actually, for those of you that have seen the Peter Jackson documentary, They Shall Not Grow Old, which I highly recommend to any of you, absolutely fascinating and really well done documentary on the British experience in World War I. I think one of the things that Jackson did that was maybe more for a modern audience and less accurate was really focusing on the tanks. Because no, I don't think the tanks really had like the same sort of effect they did in the Second World War. And remarkably, in the Second World War, the German tanks, I believe, were actually better than the American tanks. The Germans in the First World War had enough ways of just putting tanks out of commission that they didn't feel that they needed tanks to fight the tanks. They could take out Allied tanks with other means.
First, that was an excellent talk.
So thank you.
My father was a young doctor for about 6 months with the AEF during the war, and of course his letters were censored. But I've read his letters home, and one of the features of them was how often he and other medics and also soldiers played baseball together.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. I have seen, baseball, reports of football games, and even weirdly enough for America, reports of soccer games as well being played by AEF soldiers.
Oh, hey, over here, other side. Hi.
Yeah, hey.
Yeah, just to bring the focus back to kind of the letters that you were looking at the Clements Library, I was wondering if you could talk about the collections you actually looked at and whether there are any specific stories or trends from the letters themselves that you noticed or that you want to talk about and share that maybe didn't make it into the exhibit or didn't make it into your talk?
Awesome. Thank you for bringing that up. That's like, this talk could have been 3 hours long, and the exhibit could have been, 100 cases. The Clements actually has a remarkable amount of World War I material. And in the pamphlet that goes along with this exhibit, there's a list of like 101 different collections at the Clements that relate to the First World War. I think my absolute favorite correspondence was probably done by a engineer, a private in the engineers from Massachusetts, Thomas Knowles is his name. There's just something very sweet about him, and he's writing to a classmate of his who clearly doesn't know him that well. Oftentimes, in this war, like in other conflicts, women at home would volunteer to be pen pals to various soldiers. So this is what the basis of their relationship is. And he's just so sweet and turns 21 on the trip over. He manages to make it through the war, even though he's like pretty badly wounded at one point. And just the way he writes. And actually, this is something that then, your mention of the French and British, training them in the States, and once they get over, he has a great line where he's saying, darn French lectures, like, just basically sleep through them. So it's very, very interesting. That, and then probably the other collection, which is in the exhibit, but, I wasn't able to focus too much on his correspondence, is the Brewster Littlefield collection. Actually, weirdly enough, also from the same exact regiment as Thomas Knowles. Brewster Littlefield was killed about 10 days before the armistice, and his letters to his parents are just heartbreaking because his older brother dies of the flu back in the States, and he receives word of this. So one of his last letters home is to his parents saying, "Don't worry about me. I'm so sorry to hear about it." It's heartbreaking stuff, and it is like there were certain times in researching this, I just had to stop for a little bit. It was it was getting to me too personally.
Hey, so I always hear a lot about the Americans who went off and joined the French and German armies at the start of the war. I was wondering if you had any examples of Americans going off and joining the lesser heard of countries of the war, like Austria or the Ottomans or Bulgaria.
Great question. I am not aware of that. Like you, I kind of tend to think of Germany, France, French Foreign Legion, the Lafayette, brigade of the fighters. I'll have to get, talk to me after this, and I can look into that and let you know what I find.
I think Hemingway fought with the Italians.
Yes, he served in the there's an American ambulance service. It was set up in 1914 that kind of served with the French and the Italians and the Allies. So it was kind of a quasi-American organization once the Americans entered the war in particular. But you're right, he was in Italy with the Italian army.
Excellent talk.
Thank you.
I know you're focusing on the Clements archives. I was just wondering, in doing that, did you have an opportunity to interact with the World War I Museum in Kansas City? And if you have not been there, that is probably the most visual war, non-war site I have ever been. I spent 5 hours there and could have spent 5 days. It's spectacular.
Oh, that's, you know what, like, you're not the first person to tell me that. I've heard that from many of my colleagues who have been able to attend. I've heard that it's absolutely remarkable. And yes, it is on my bucket list of places to visit. And it's really interesting, in fact, because it's not only that it's a great museum, but it's actually a war memorial in itself. It was dedicated in the 1920s as part of the kind of American memory of the war, which is my personal kind of scholarly interest in this stuff. Yep, yep.
Louie, have you run across in your research instances of backlash against German Americans? As you probably know, Ann Arbor has a large, and did have a very large population of German Americans. I think there were a couple of instances during World War I where there were backlash incidents in this community. Can you describe your experiences on that?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Dick. You know, my former colleagues from the Bentley actually would be great to talk about this, because one such incident was, I believe, 2 German faculty at the U of M being forced out. 4? Was it 4? Okay, no, yeah. Okay, so for those of you interested in learning more about that specific event, go to the Bentley Historical Library on North Campus. You know, just like the Clements, as long as you register and agree to the terms and conditions, you can do research in the reading room. And I bet if you look in the Department of German files from that period, you're going to find a lot of correspondence about this incident. I have heard of other examples. One such example in Minnesota of a guy being tarred and feathered because of not contributing to a Liberty Bond campaign. Off the top of my head, there's not any other ones that jump out, but you're right. I mean, I think there was a significant backlash against German Americans who stuck up for the German Empire. But what was so interesting to me was the amount of German Americans who clearly are second generation, third generation at most, who immediately take on the kind of, you know, anti-German sentiment of their peers, even though, you know, they're of German descent too.
Okay, so I see that there are still more questions, but we need to go over and look at the exhibit. So Louie will be there. We can talk to him more over at the Clements Library. So I invite you now to head over to the Clements Library so that we can view the exhibit. Thank you so much, Louie.
Thank you all. Not in the exhibit, but there is plenty of occupation stuff at the Clements. You know what's interesting to me, and it's almost like a theory that I would have